Well, good afternoon. Welcome to another Friday live stream. I have a subject today that I am pretty enthusiastic about, and I'll get into that. It's about the conversions of or the claim of a Christian faith by a growing number of public intellectuals and influential people. Unexpected. But I need to say, all this is my perspective. It's nothing official from YWAM, and it's available on a wide number of platforms on my website, which I encourage you to visit. Look at other videos and other resources that are there, and also on our YouTube channel and on Spotify and iTunes and so on. So we try to get it out in as many places as possible, and we really appreciate every viewer and every person who looks at these things and then goes away thinking, I got to get somebody else to watch that, some friend. So, we put the work into this, and we are grateful for everybody who watches, and we look for more. So just want to give a little historical perspective on what I'm talking about, because I came into Youth with Mission at a time where only looking back on do we realize that it was a sort of revival period. And some of you will have heard my story of seeing a revival in a small town and up to 300 young people getting saved in a short period of time and going on and being world changers. And a remarkable sovereign move of God as the fruit of a woman with multiple sclerosis in a care home, interceding by the hour, and always having an open door to young people to visit her. So it was a classic story, like the Hebrides revivals of Duncan Campbell's time in the 50s and 60s in northern Scotland, where intercessors hung on to God, knocking, asking, seeking, until they got what they asked for, which was revival. Another great story there. And it was our privilege to sit at the feet of Duncan Campbell from 1969 on through until he died at a YWAM school in Lausanne in 73, I think. So remarkable privilege to have this man who was the catalyst for the Hebrides revival, so miraculous, to be with us, he and his wife, godly people. Well, we were then in the midst of a move of God that, because we were in the middle of it, it was like fish in water. You don't know what the water is because it's just your norm. And we know, looking back, that one of the reasons why YWAM grew all over the world, but we look especially here in England, where Marty and I were, was that there was an environment of a move of God which has been captured, well, one little aspect of it captured very well in a very watchable film called The Jesus Revolution, and it stars Kelsey Grammer. If you ever watch Frasier or Cheers, he's a great comedic character. But in this one, he's the pastor Chuck Smith that went on to be a real world changer with a whole Calvary Chapel movement globally, and he plays it very well. And just saying how this new move of God, that time starting 67, 68, 69. All these radical young people, because my generation was really rebellious. We were tired of the status quo, and there were demonstrations in the street and civil disobedience and deep anger over the Vietnamese War and the cost in lives and the cost to America, providing a war that people thought, if that group of people, that nation, the tribes in that nation, want to align themselves with the international communist movement, who are we to stop them? And of course, we were at a time when international socialism, communism was becoming, well, it was already quite favorably viewed by academics and the humanities and universities. So that kind of fed into the unrest. And during that time, tens of thousands of young people came to Jesus in the Jesus Revolution. And it wasn't just there in Southern California. It was also, in Europe. And when we came to England, everywhere we went, especially starting firstly in Northern Ireland, God gave us favor. What was it? Well, it was just a general environment of people looking for more realistic, more satisfying, more deeply spiritual answers than they had in all the philosophies that were being fed their way. And when they encountered Jesus, and the Holy Spirit was just moving, when they encountered Jesus and the power of the Holy Spirit, so many turned to Christ. That was a really, really wonderful time where the work of YWAM in this country, with Marty and me still in our early to mid-20s, it just grew dramatically. And before 5 years had elapsed, we had 2 big country manor houses full of young people growing in God and going out to reach the nation in evangelism. So that was a move of God then. And if you haven't seen the Jesus Revolution, do have a look at it. I found it fascinating. I think I would have found it fascinating even if I wasn't of that generation. The reason why I mention it in this context is that I think we are in a similar buildup of what you might refer to as a ripe harvest, as sort of defined by one of the parables that Jesus gave, where the fields are ripe for harvest. And, there are cultural things that happen and historical events and economics that go up and down and the rise and fall of other philosophies and religions and, basically lots of different possible sources of lasting hope that then fail. And people get more and more desperate to find out, is there anything that fills this void in my life? And that's when you start seeing a move of God. When there has been prayer, lots of prayer, for the Lord to send laborers into the harvest and for the Lord to keep ripening the harvest so that people will begin to be open to the gospel. And that's what's happening now. I got an email yesterday from a leader of a university campus-based ministry, something that we had a hand in starting back in the 80s, early 90s. And the guy who leads it now was saying, there's so many people coming to the Lord from completely non-Christian backgrounds. They don't know anything about the Bible. They don't have any church language. They don't know what church is about at all. And they're not likely to fit in the existing churches. So that's another story. But what do we do about that? And initially, see, I think the church should always become one, but there still is a sense in which what happened in the early church happens now, which is the church tended to have some places where the Jews were comfortable and some places where the Greeks or the non-Jews were comfortable, and they didn't mix very well. And Paul often had to write or just preach in such a way that there was a oneness between Jews and Greeks, as it was called in shorthand. So, but I was really interested in that because I think, okay, I know people who are really now, they've got a sense that God has called them to plant churches. I've had another one of those kinds of emails and correspondence back this week. I have a friend who I think God is with so much, and his vision is to plant 10,000 new churches in this country. And when I first heard that, I thought, really? Because that was a little while ago. But now I think, yeah, that's right. I worked pretty hard in starting a thing called Challenge 2000 back in 91, 89, 90, when we were doing March for Jesus. And some of you know what that is and many don't. But it gave us a platform. And I really felt we needed to talk about saturation church planting, that there needed to always be new churches that started. That is, new home groups, new local congregations, because the unity of the church is not about one great big organization. It's about many different cells working together in real oneness. So we tried to get the resistance to the idea of church planting that was prominent and prevalent in the church in England. We wanted to reduce that resistance, and it has reduced. And so now here's a man who's in the Church of England and believes God is saying, trust me for, pray for, work for 10,000 new churches. So all this indicates that the move of God is underway. And I've been saying that for a couple of years now. I really believe it. But one of the things that has taken me by surprise is that this move of God has a characteristic at these early stages that I didn't see at all in the 60s, 70s, 80s. And that is that before there's a widespread understanding that something is happening with the growth of Christianity, we're having pretty high-profile public intellectuals primarily, some celebrities, but especially public intellectuals who are saying that they met with Jesus Christ, that sometimes they say, well, I don't go to church, but I really believe in Jesus, and I have friends who believe in Jesus, and so on. And I'll probably do a little series of this where I want to focus on some of those people who are coming to faith, and then look at, and we probably won't get into it today, but we will look at, what about the old argument about, if you're not living like Jesus, if you're not really deeply, deeply committed to the Lordship of Christ and wholly abandoned to his Lordship, then please don't call it Christianity. That happened with the Reformation. With the Reformation, there was a tendency that the reformers eventually, after a while, even during Luther's time, went for conversion of the rulers of a given territory of Europe to start with, and it was a revolution that happened top down. How much did it really impact the hearts of people? Well, it's hard to say. It certainly did a lot of people, but it was taking a Catholic church and a priest and all their structure, where they were quite dominant in the princedoms of Europe, and they would see the prince or the leader, whoever it was, the governmental head, was always governmental, religious, and military altogether. They would see that person swear loyalty to the Reformed Church, to the Lutheran Church, or the Church of England, and suddenly everybody who was Catholic is now Protestant. And what happened? Well, it's hard to say. But at the same time, there was this move of God amongst the Anabaptists, people like the Mennonites, people like the Moravians, where they said, no, it's about personal conversion. It's about submission to the Lordship of Jesus. It's about repenting and coming into the kingdom. It's about what 1 John says: if you believe in him, then you must behave like him. And so the goal of behaving like Jesus keeps us repentant and growing in faith and love our whole lives. And they were about that. They were called the Anabaptists because they did not accept the baptism of children as a sign of being really committed Christians. So they required people to be baptized as consenting adults. So Anna meant again baptized. So, and what happened? Well, the reformers killed a lot of Anabaptists. We're not killing each other now, thankfully. But I want to talk about the benefits of this civilizational or civic Christianity, which is different than that deeply committed Christian faith where Jesus really is the center of people's lives and they're really daily seeking obedience to him. And how do those coexist, or do they, or should they? And we'll talk about that a bit. So that's later. But today I want to get us started on this series. I don't remember exactly when we started today. Do you have any idea, Tiago, how far in we are? We have 5 minutes to go, 10 minutes to go. 15. Oh, good. I've been talking fast. Good. All right. Well, I started following some of these public intellectuals, and I want to talk about two today, and a third one, Simi, who did not come onto the public scene as Christians. And I was not interested in them primarily because they were saying they were Christians. They weren't. I was interested in them because they represented something that I thought was extraordinary. People with real intellectual capacity who had believed other stuff and had become disillusioned with it and were feeling their way forward, and what they were writing and what they were saying and what they were doing podcasts about was captivating because I could see them feeling their way towards truth. And much of what they said made so much sense. So the first one I want to mention is somebody, I read her first book over 10 years ago, I think. And it's called Nomad, Ayin Hirsi Ali. She was a Somalian refugee. So she was caught up in that awful environment in Somalia of tribal warfare, of one warlord against another, one tribe against another, and in the context of some pretty fundamentalist radical Islam. And so life for a young woman then was a horror story. They were just somebody's possession and bought and sold. She and her friend were, I don't know why, but they were people with real initiative. And they decided they were just going to walk out of Somalia. And they did. And they got to a refugee camp because there were many, many people leaving Somalia. Rarely was it two teenage girls walking out on their own. But they reached to a refugee camp where they stayed for many months. And then there was almost like a lottery. Names were just chosen apparently at random about who got to be transferred to a destination country. And they won the lottery and they got transferred to Holland. And the book Nomad is really worth reading, even though it's a good 10 years old now. It's just such a great insight into what it's like for somebody to come out of one of these less developed nations that have a whole different set of values and a whole different economy and as such, and usually violent and dangerous. And to see them come into Holland, Holland led the radical reform back in the 16th, 17th century. So it was one of the first nations that really had accountable government, and I won't go into all that, but they really were a pioneer nation, a place where Protestant Christianity and radical Christianity took deep roots, and the signs of it are still everywhere in Holland today. So they came into this environment, and I thought one of the funniest stories was the social services met them, gave them an apartment, and then gave them their first month's money. And they didn't understand what was going on. And they thought, we're rich. We're rich. We've got a house, and we've got all this money. What do rich people do? And in their youth and naivety as far as Western ways go, they thought, well, the rich people we've met have chandeliers. So they went out and bought a chandelier for their apartment. And of course, they used up their month's allotment for their food and clothing and all the rest. And so there was a process of education. But Ayin Hirsi Ali is a very, very intelligent woman. She learned very fast. She learned Dutch very fast. Before long, she was a member of parliament in Holland. And as she tasted the freedom of a free market society, of an accountable government, of elections and representative government and safety on the streets and cleanliness and wonderful, she compared it to her life as a Muslim girl under the authority of heartless Muslim men. And she worked with a Dutch filmmaker to do a documentary expose on Islam as she knew it. That was well received in Holland, not well received by the Muslim population there. And her director, who made that documentary with her, was stabbed to death on the streets of Amsterdam, and with a note stabbed to his chest saying, Ayin Hirsi Ali is next. Well, that led to her having to flee Holland and eventually going to the United States, where she plugged into some academic institutions and gained some more degrees. and ended up as a fellow in the Hoover Institution in Stanford. And she became one of the members of the New Atheist group. So Richard Dawkins was a real sort of intellectual father. If you don't know that name, he was probably, he was the most famous and is the most famous of the New Atheists. And they were very aggressive with their atheism. They were scathing and mocking about Christian faith. And she went along with all that. And yet she had this deep, deep unsettledness in her spirit and deep unhappiness in her being. And that led to depression. And that led to addiction. And that led to, as she says, well, let me read some of what she says. I looked up a bit and printed it out. Because she became a Christian. Okay, so that's why it reads this way. And you can see why as I read it. Yet, she said, I would not be truthful if I attributed my embrace of Christianity solely to the realization that atheism is too weak and divisive a doctrine to fortify us against our menacing foes. I have also turned to Christianity because I ultimately found life without any spiritual solace unendurable. Indeed, very nearly self-destructive. Atheism failed to answer a simple question: what is the meaning and purpose of life? So she found herself in depression, leading into alcoholism, and at another point, is it here? Well, yes, it's here, I think. I had a personal crisis, she said. I lived for about a decade with intense depression and anxiety and self-loathing. I hit rock bottom. I went to a place where I actually did not want to live anymore, but wasn't brave enough to take my own life. I had, over a long period of time, seen a psychiatrist and other doctors. I was trying to understand my condition and trying to treat it with the help of pure evidence-based science. Because, of course, that's what she trusted. Because there's a modern deception that it was science and maybe linked to Greek thought that produced all the freedom, produced all the prosperity and the safety and all the rest. So she looked for the answer in science. And last year, I saw one therapist who said, perhaps it's something else that you have. And she described it as spiritual bankruptcy. And she said, why don't you try praying? Well, how do you tell an atheist to try praying and have it make any sense to her at all? But somehow that resonated with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and she thought, I will try praying. And the therapist gave her a few hints on how to start and a few guidelines where she could look for help, and she started praying. So she then says, having reached a place where I had absolutely nothing to lose, I prayed, and I prayed desperately. And for me, that was the turning point. And what happened after that is a miracle in its own right. I feel connected to something higher and greater than myself. My zest for life is back. And that experience has filled me with humility. Fantastic. I love that testimony. Isn't that great? Well, she's married to Neil Ferguson. Now, do you recognize that name? Neil Ferguson is a Harvard historian, a historian of economics. And they obviously fell in love. They got married. And I wondered, for this last year, because I happened to be in a meeting where Ayaan Hirsi Ali spoke about her acceptance of Jesus and her love for what she's learning as a Christian. And one of the things she says, I'm going to church regularly and I learn more every single week. That's great. And then just this last week, I read an article with Neil Ferguson saying that he too was a Christian and was learning week in and week out. I thought, well, that's fantastic, because he's one of the most widely read because he writes so well, and he writes so you always learn a lot when you read his stuff, but it's also understandable. And his analysis of what's happening in the world today is excellent. And it's just lovely to see that this man who's really pursued the truth um, has now also come to an active faith. And I want to finish by just talking about, in a way, the guy who started it all for me, because although I was reading Ayan Hirsi Ali, she was not talking anything about Christianity or any spirituality. I just found her really interesting. But 10 years ago, no, not quite that long, maybe 8 years ago, my eldest son said, "Dad, have you heard of Dr. Jordan Peterson?" I said, "No." And he said, well, you should listen to him. And I said, "Okay." And it's one of those things, Michael's always ahead of me in a lot of things. And you know, whenever you think of some about something, you think, well, when I have time, well, then you never do it. So he came back to me again and said, "Dad, have you listened to him?" I said, "No, I will." And Marty and I took a little holiday break, and I started listening online to it was an interview with a Channel 4 here in England interviewer and newscaster, Kathy Newman, interviewing this man called Dr. Jordan Peterson. And it was a fantastic interview. I just thought the guy was amazing. He was such a clear thinker. He expressed things so well. He had exactly the right words. He was funny. He was serious. He was on the verge of anger at times, and I thought, this is an amazing character. And I began to follow him. And it wasn't long before I learned that he'd done a series on the book of Genesis at his university. Great stuff, all available online. And I enjoyed that. And then he became famous, partly because of that interview. But the interview happened because there was a bill that was eventually passed through Parliament in Canada, where he's a citizen, which required people to use the pronouns that someone else required of them. So he said in subsequent interviews, "I've never refused to call anybody by a preferred pronoun. That's just, I respect people." But he said, "This is the first time in history, in the history of English common law and all of its children and stepchildren, where government has impelled or compelled speech. And I'm not going to do it because this is a desperately dangerous development." I thought, oh man, he's thought things through so well. And as I began to follow him and I saw the things that he got out of the book of Genesis, I thought, boy, this guy is surely on a pathway to faith. And then 2 tragedies struck. He was going at a tremendous pace because he suddenly became world famous through these events I've just mentioned. And he began to struggle with an old problem of anxiety and depression. What he didn't know is he had an autoimmune disease, which impacted his emotions too. That has now been resolved in a way that maybe I can tell you about next time. But what tipped him over the edge is that his wife wasn't feeling well, and she went to the doctor, who sent her to an oncologist, and she was diagnosed with a stage 4 cancer that was inevitably terminable. And he's had such a close relationship with his wife, who's been his friend across the street from the time they were 8 years old. It's tipped him into despair. So he went on to, what is it called? I didn't write it down. I'll get it next time. So hang on until next week when you hear about what it was. But a common antidepressant prescribed by 2 doctors. And then he upped the dose. Well, they upped the dose. And eventually he was addicted. It doesn't take long. And then when he tried to come off of it, he went into agonizing withdrawal symptoms and just could not function. It was a benzodiazepine, I think that's the name. And his family took him to various places to be treated. He was so near death, and he did not want to live, but he just knew he had to. He's got an iron will. And eventually he came out of it. And as he did, his wife had been healed of the cancer through a very godly little prayer group that was associated with a local Catholic church. And she has a deep faith now. So he began to grow more and more towards that faith. But as he was also doing more work on the Bible, then he did a fantastic series with 7 other scholars, some Jews, some of Catholic background, some of Protestant, some philosophers on the book of Exodus. Just really interesting free-form discussion. And you can see this guy is just finding more and more truth. He's speaking more and more clarity. And now he's completed a series that's available on the Daily Wire on the Gospels. And the result is, in the last month, he said, I'm a Christian. I'm a new kind of Christian. Now, I thought all those years, and I think it's probably truth in this, that he did not want to identify as a Christian because it would allow his opponents to pigeonhole him, saying, okay, another stereotypical Christian. And I can see why he avoided that strategically. But I also think he's been quite clear that Christian means, originally, Christ-like. And he said, I can't call myself that, because as far as I'm concerned, there's only ever been one Christian, and that was Jesus of Nazareth. And that betrays such a sensitive conscience, I think, and such careful and detailed self-analysis that I just really respect it. But now he's saying, okay, but I want to say I'm different because of those reasons. So I want to finish by saying this. It's just something personal. I've really enjoyed these, and I'm going to go on and talk about other public intellectuals who come to faith, and this thing of civic Christianity as opposed to really deeply committed Christianity, and can they work together? But what Jordan Peterson was talking about, deep introspection, I have another book that I've been reading recently of the conversion of the daughter of a friend of ours who's been deep into the occult, and her story of coming to Christ and growing in faith is one that has a depth about repentance and letting the Holy Spirit search our hearts daily. And I'll tell you the rest of that story later, because it's put me on a deeper road over just the last couple weeks now that I'm going public in it, because it'll help me stay on that road. But I'll come back and talk about it probably next week. So tune in then, and I'll try to get a post up on my YouTube or on my Facebook pages before I do that. But remember, Friday afternoon at 4 p.m. GMT next week. What is that, the last week? Yeah, the last week of January. So that'll be the 30th. Do tune in, and I'll talk more about this book, this wonderful, incredible story of this conversion and growth in Christ. And lots more. So I've gone over time, but thanks for watching.